At 64 years old, Evelyn Hayes stared at the deed to a condemned slaughterhouse her husband had just slid across their anniversary dinner table. But what Arthur didn't know, what his polished arrogance made him entirely blind to, was that the rust and rotting timber hid a legal empire. What he discarded as a final insult was actually the master key to everything he had spent a lifetime trying to build. If you've ever watched someone you loved dismantle your life with a calm smile, if you've ever been handed the scrapings of your own hard work while others took the feast, if you've ever held a heavy brass key and wondered if it was the end of your story or the beginning of a different one entirely, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Evelyn uncovered in that freezing, abandoned foreman's office is going to change the way you look at endings forever. You cannot afford to miss how 40 years of quiet submission turned into a masterclass in absolute justice. The restaurant hummed with the quiet clink of crystal and silver. Evelyn sat perfectly still in her dark navy wool coat. She did not look at the other patrons. She did not look at the rain streaking the tall glass windows. She looked only at the single sheet of paper resting next to her untouched water glass. She had spent 40 years building the man sitting across from her. She had signed away her own father's modest inheritance to save Arthur's first commercial project when the bank threatened foreclosure. She had managed his commercial real estate books for 4 decades without ever drawing a single paycheck. She had hosted countless dinners for his investors, smiling through their condescension while she silently tracked the exact margins that kept the company afloat. She had been the invisible foundation of his empire. She had never asked for her name on a single building. She had never demanded a separate bank account. She had simply done the work. Her right hand rested deep in her coat pocket. Her fingers traced the jagged teeth of a heavy brass key stamped with the year 1952. It was the only thing of her father's she had kept. It was a relic from a time when the industrial district actually produced things you could hold in your hands. It was the only thing Arthur had not figured out how to monetize. Arthur was checking his reflection in the blade of a silver butter knife. He adjusted his silk tie with careful, practiced movements. He had just handed her a ruin after taking her life, and he was fixing his collar. He was already moving on to his next appointment. He did not even look up to see if she was crying. Evelyn was not crying. She was simply observing the man she had married as if he were a stranger. She saw the exact moment he dismissed her from his mind. She saw the way his shoulders relaxed, believing the transaction was complete. He thought he had won. He thought he had secured millions while leaving her with a toxic liability. He was wrong. He was mathematically, legally, and fundamentally wrong. The slaughterhouse was located on the far eastern edge of the city. It sat on a triangular plot of land, bordered by a dead river and a failing rail line. Arthur had acquired it years ago as part of a larger bankruptcy liquidation. He had complained about the property taxes ever since. He had never once stepped foot inside the rusted gates. He considered it a stain on his immaculate portfolio. But Evelyn remembered the slaughterhouse differently. She remembered when the smokestacks breathed fire into the winter sky. She remembered the sound of heavy trucks rolling over the cobblestone streets before dawn. She remembered her father walking through those gates with this exact brass key in his pocket. The key felt heavy and warm against her palm. It grounded her in the present moment. It reminded her that before she was Arthur's silent partner, she was her father's daughter. Evelyn Hayes, 64 years old, took a slow breath. The air in the restaurant smelled of expensive perfume and roasted meats. It was a stark contrast to the scent of copper and old wood she associated with her childhood. She watched Arthur signal the waiter for the check. He used 2 fingers, a sharp, dismissive gesture. He had always treated the service staff as obstacles rather than people. She had spent decades apologizing for that exact gesture, with quiet tips left under napkins. She would not apologize for him ever again. The waiter approached the table with a black leather folder. Arthur slid a platinum credit card out of his wallet without looking at the bill. The wallet was a gift she had purchased for him 10 years ago. She had spent 3 months saving from her modest grocery allowance to buy the Italian leather. He had never asked how she managed to afford it. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, striking the glass in heavy sheets. The streetlights cast distorted yellow reflections across the wet pavement. It was the kind of cold that settled into bones and refused to leave. Evelyn knew she would be walking out into that cold very soon. She knew she had nothing left but the clothes she was wearing and the key in her pocket. But she also knew something else. She knew the exact dimensions of the old foreman's office at the slaughterhouse. She knew the specific sound the floorboards made when you walked across the back corner. She knew her father had never trusted banks, and he had never trusted lawyers. Arthur placed his hands flat on the table and leaned forward. He looked at the deed resting near her glass. He was waiting for her to speak. He was waiting for her to break down or beg. Evelyn gave him nothing. She kept her right hand in her pocket. She kept her breathing steady and slow. She looked at the deed. Then she looked directly into Arthur's eyes. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Evelyn Hayes had been 24 years old when she first believed Arthur's promises. Now, at 64 years old, she understood the exact mathematical cost of that belief. She sat in the upscale restaurant, listening to the rain against the glass. She thought about the ordinary physical rhythm of the life she was losing. For 40 years, Evelyn woke at 4 in the morning. She ground the specific dark roast coffee Arthur required. She laid his pressed wool suits across the wooden valet stand. She knew exactly how much pressure to apply to his collar when ironing. She organized the daily banking receipts into color-coded folders on the kitchen island. She placed his daily vitamins in a small white ceramic bowl beside his keys. She managed the crisis when the downtown plumbing failed on a holiday weekend. She spent 40 years making sure Arthur never had to experience friction. She maintained the quiet, invisible machinery of his daily existence. She did this without being asked and without receiving thanks. She remembered exactly why she had trusted him. The memory belonged to a freezing Tuesday in 1984. They were standing inside a hollowed-out warehouse on the east side. Freezing rain poured through a completely collapsed section of the roof. Arthur had pulled her under the only dry concrete overhang. He took off his own dry wool scarf. He wrapped it tightly around her neck to block the wind. He pointed to the ruined walls and described a gleaming office park. He looked directly into her eyes and said they were building a fortress. He said the fortress was for them. She felt the warmth of his scarf against her skin. She looked at the rotting wood and believed the fortress was real. She built that fortress for him with her own hands. The bank sent a foreclosure notice for his first project. She emptied her father's modest savings account into Arthur's business ledger. She sold her grandmother's antique silver. She handed the cash directly to his first general contractor. For 35 years, she worked out of a windowless, converted closet. She balanced the commercial real estate accounts every evening. She typed out the intricate commercial lease agreements on a manual typewriter. When they finally bought computers, she kept the same small desk. She answered the corporate phones using the company name, never her own. She kept a detailed mental map of every property line they owned. She knew the building codes better than the city inspectors. She cooked elaborate dinners for hundreds of potential investors over the decades. She knew which investors drank scotch and which preferred sparkling water. She smiled politely when those investors spoke right through her. She organized the annual civic galas where Arthur courted city politicians. She sewed her own formal dresses on a used sewing machine. The company kept the money she saved. She stood in the back of the ballroom near the kitchen doors. She watched Arthur accept the Civic Development Awards on the brightly lit stage. She drove the late-night deposit bags to the bank drop box in the snow. She ran the billing department for a multi-million-dollar portfolio. She never once drew a salary. She never asked for her name on a single operating agreement. She never requested stock options or separate financial accounts. Her right hand rested deep inside her dark navy wool coat. Her fingers traced the heavy brass key stamped with the year 1952. The metal was worn completely smooth on the left side. Decades of friction against fabric had polished the brass to a dull shine. The numbers were stamped deeply into the thick metal bow. Her father had pressed this key into her hand in his hospital room. He had smelled of sharp iodine and clean cotton sheets. He told her the old slaughterhouse was the only ground they truly owned. He had built the slaughterhouse office with his own hands. He had laid the red bricks one by one in the summer heat. He had believed in producing things you could measure and weigh. He did not believe in paper empires or hollow corporate shells. The brass key was the physical proof of his labor. The key was heavy and required a forceful push to turn any lock. She had carried it in her pocket every single day since he passed. Evelyn traced the jagged teeth of the key with her thumb. It was a small, quiet anchor in a room full of expensive noise. The slaughterhouse was a towering brick ruin on the industrial edge of town. Arthur had acquired the land surrounding it during a bankruptcy liquidation years ago. He had always viewed her father's building as a toxic liability. He complained about the property taxes every single quarter. He had never once stepped foot inside the rusted perimeter gates. He considered the property a stubborn stain on his immaculate corporate portfolio. Evelyn Hayes, 64 years old, sat across from her husband. The fortress they had built together was finally complete. The heavy iron gates of that fortress were firmly locked. She was standing on the outside. Arthur adjusted his cuffs and looked at his expensive watch. He was a man completely satisfied with his own architecture. The waiter removed the untouched appetizer plates from the white linen tablecloth. The amber light from the brass table lamp caught the crystal water glasses. Rain lashed against the tall dining room windows in heavy sheets. Jazz played softly from hidden speakers in the ceiling. Arthur reached down to the floor beside his chair. He lifted his tailored leather briefcase and set it on his knees. He unclasped the brass locks with a sharp double click. He withdrew a thick manila envelope. He placed it flat on the table. He slid it past the silver salt shaker. He stopped it exactly 2 inches from Evelyn's water glass. The envelope was thick and heavy and sealed with a metal clasp. "We're just being realistic, Evelyn," Arthur said. He picked up his wine glass by the thin crystal stem. "At your age, you can't manage the stress of the corporate portfolio anyway." He took a slow sip of the red wine. "This is what's best for everyone." Evelyn looked down at the envelope. The return address belonged to the city's most expensive corporate law firm. It was the firm she had hired to defend his first zoning violation 30 years ago. She had typed the original retainer check for that firm on her manual typewriter. She slid her thumb under the metal clasp. She bent the soft metal backward. She opened the paper flap. She pulled out the thick stack of stapled legal documents. The bold heading on the first page read, "Final dissolution of marriage and corporate assets." Arthur signaled the waiter with 2 raised fingers. He pointed to his empty bread plate and nodded. He was ordering fresh sourdough while his wife of 40 years read her own eviction. Evelyn turned to the second page of the document. The ink was stark black against the bright white paper. The division of assets was laid out in rigid paragraphs. The glass office tower to Arthur. The suburban estate to Arthur. The corporate investment accounts to Arthur. While he buttered a fresh piece of sourdough and checked his phone for messages, Evelyn received what he called the practical settlement, a condemned brick slaughterhouse and the tax debt attached to its rotting roof. Evelyn read the asset paragraphs a second time. Her name had been systematically erased from 4 decades of labor. Every late night balancing the ledgers had been legally assigned a value of 0. Every gala she had organized had been transferred into his sole ownership. She looked up across the table. Arthur was wiping a breadstick crumb from his silk tie. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Arthur said. He set his heavy cloth napkin down next to his plate. "It's a clean break, Evelyn. This is entirely fair." He leaned back in his tufted leather chair. "You'll be so much more comfortable out of the city center." He looked at the rain hitting the window glass. "You should have been more financially responsible, Evelyn. This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead." Evelyn stared at his face. He had just claimed her 40 years of unpaid labor as his own solitary genius. He had just accused her of financial negligence while actively stealing her life's work. He truly believed his own version of the story. The waiter returned and placed the main courses on the table. Arthur picked up his heavy silver steak knife. He began cutting his meat with precise, practiced motions. He did not look at the manila envelope again. He did not look at his wife's face. He carefully moved his water glass so the envelope would not scratch the crystal base. He had already mentally categorized her as a completed transaction. Evelyn placed her right hand back inside her heavy navy wool coat. Her fingers found the heavy brass key stamped with 1952. The metal was ice cold against her skin. She pressed the jagged teeth into her palm until the skin stung. The sharp physical pressure kept her breathing steady and even. She did not throw the water glass at the wall. She did not scream at him across the white linen tablecloth. She did not beg him to remember the freezing warehouse in 1984. She slid the thick stack of papers back into the manila envelope. She folded the metal clasp down completely flat. Arthur looked up from his expensive steak. He held his silver fork suspended in the air. He was waiting for the emotional outburst his corporate lawyers had prepared him for. He had a rehearsed speech ready about maintaining their dignity in public spaces. Evelyn picked up the envelope. She tucked it securely under her left arm. She looked directly at the man she had built from absolutely nothing. "You are leaving me the slaughterhouse," Evelyn said. Her voice was perfectly level and quiet. "Yes," Arthur said, taking a bite of his steak. "It's yours." Evelyn nodded once. She walked out of the restaurant. Evelyn Hayes stepped through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant. The November wind immediately hit her face. The freezing rain soaked into the shoulders of her dark navy wool coat. She walked half a block before stopping under the canvas awning of a closed florist. The streetlights buzzed overhead with a low, electric hum. Water poured from the edge of the awning and splashed against her leather boots. She stood completely still in the shadows. She opened her worn leather purse with stiff, freezing fingers. She unzipped the small change compartment hidden in the lining. She pulled out 3 crumpled $10 bills. She found 1 $5 bill and 7 $1 bills. She counted the silver coins resting in the bottom seam. She possessed exactly $42.12 in the entire world. She stared at the damp paper money in her calloused hands. She thought, "I am 64 years old." She thought, "I cannot afford first month, last month, and a security deposit anywhere." She thought, "This money will not even buy 3 nights in a safe motel." She carefully zipped the money back into the compartment. She pulled her smartphone from the side pocket of her purse. She pressed the side button. The glass screen illuminated her face in the dark alleyway. She stared at the notification center. 0 missed calls, 0 new text messages. The missed calls counter remained a flat, gray circle. The screen showed only an automated weather alert warning of freezing temperatures overnight. 40 years of marriage had ended 20 minutes ago. Nobody had reached out to ask where she was going. The hundreds of friends they had hosted for dinners belonged entirely to Arthur. They were investors, contractors, and city officials. They would never risk their lucrative investments to check on an exiled wife. Her silence was required by the power Arthur held over their careers. The phone screen timed out and went completely black. She saw her own tired reflection in the dark glass. She slipped the dead device back into her purse. She slid her bare right hand deep into her coat pocket. Her fingers immediately found the heavy brass key. Her thumb traced the deep numbers stamped into the thick metal bow. 1952. The brass was the only solid thing she had left. The metal absorbed the small amount of heat left in her hand. She could walk to the municipal women's shelter near the courthouse. She could use her $42.12 to buy a bus ticket. She could surrender to the absolute erasure Arthur had planned for her. But the brass key pressed its heavy weight into her palm. It felt like an anchor pulling her toward the eastern edge of the city. Her father had laid the red bricks of that slaughterhouse himself. He had built that foreman's office to withstand the brutal river winds. Arthur had handed her the deed as a final, calculated insult. Arthur believed the rotting wood and rusted gates would finally break her. Evelyn tightened her grip on the brass key. She looked down the long, rain-slicked avenue. The city center glittered with the glass towers she had helped finance and build. She turned her back to the gleaming skyscrapers. She faced the dark, unlit eastern horizon. The abandoned industrial district lay 2 miles away in the freezing rain. She stepped out from under the canvas awning. The cold water immediately soaked through her shoes. She kept walking. The 2-mile walk through the freezing rain took exactly 94 minutes. The city streetlights ended half a mile before the industrial district began. Evelyn's leather boots scraped against the cracked and uneven asphalt. The cold water soaked completely through her wool coat and her practical dress. Her lower back burned with a dull, relentless ache. Her left knee throbbed with a sharp, blinding pain on every single step. She walked until her lungs burned and her legs simply refused to move. She stopped exactly where her body finally gave out. She looked up through the darkness and the driving rain. She was standing directly in front of a towering wall of rusted iron gates. The slaughterhouse was entirely worse than Arthur had ever described. The main processing roof had completely caved in decades ago. Twisted metal beams pointed toward the black sky like broken ribs. The concrete loading docks were choked with dead vines and shattered glass. The wind howled through the hollowed-out metal ventilation shafts. It looked like a monument to permanent and absolute failure, but Evelyn saw one small thing that kept her from turning around. Tucked into the front corner of the ruined lot stood the foreman's office. The red bricks her father had laid by hand were perfectly intact. The thick masonry held tight against the freezing wind and the heavy storm. The small square building stood defiant against the surrounding decay. Across the flooded street, a faded neon sign flickered through the heavy rain. It was a narrow diner with red checkered curtains in the front window. Two rusted gas pumps sat completely dark in the cracked parking lot. The glass door of the diner pushed open, spilling yellow light onto the wet pavement. An elderly man in a faded canvas work coat stepped out under the awning. He did not ask if she was lost. He did not ask why a woman in a soaked wool coat was standing in the storm. He looked straight at her face, and then at the heavy brass key in her hand. "We've been waiting for you," the man said. His voice carried easily over the sound of the freezing rain. "Henry always told us to watch for a woman carrying that exact brass key." He wiped the rain from his face with a calloused hand. "He said you'd come back eventually." Evelyn stared at the man through the sheets of rain. He nodded once, tipped his weathered cap, and went back inside the warm diner. Evelyn turned back to the heavy iron gate of the foreman's office. She stepped through the gap in the rusted chain-link fence. She walked up the 3 concrete steps to the heavy wooden door. She slid the brass key stamped 1952 into the massive iron deadbolt. She pushed her freezing fingers against the thick metal bow. She leaned her entire body weight against her right hand. The rusted internal tumblers clicked sharply in the dark. She turned the heavy brass handle. The hinges screamed against 50 years of rust and neglect. The door opened. The air inside the foreman's office smelled of wet dust and decades of undisturbed silence. Evelyn pushed the heavy wooden door shut against the howling wind. The darkness was absolute until her eyes adjusted to the pale light from the street lamp outside. The single room was completely bare except for a massive oak desk anchored to the concrete floor. She stripped off her soaked navy wool coat and draped it over the wooden chair. Her hands shook violently from the freezing air. She found a stack of flattened corrugated cardboard boxes in the back corner. She dragged them across the concrete floor to the narrow space behind the heavy desk. She found an old canvas drop cloth stiff with dried paint. She layered the cardboard over the freezing concrete and pulled the canvas over her legs. By the third morning, a rigid survival routine took hold. She woke at dawn and walked to the diner across the street to fill a plastic jug with tap water. She used her remaining $42.12 to buy 2 loaves of bread and a jar of peanut butter. She found a rusted coffee can and used it to catch the rainwater leaking through a cracked roof tile. She folded discarded newspaper into the gaps around the window frame to block the freezing drafts. She stacked salvaged red bricks to create a small, elevated platform to keep her bread dry. She spent her daylight hours clearing 50 years of debris from the office floor. She used a splintered piece of pine board to sweep the broken glass out the back door. Her hands blistered and cracked open at the knuckles. Her lower back radiated a dull, constant burning sensation. Her right knee swelled to the size of a grapefruit. Every movement required absolute physical calculation. On the 4th afternoon, the heavy wooden door pushed open. An elderly man stepped inside, carrying a dented steel thermos. He wore a faded canvas work coat and heavy leather boots. He was the man she had seen outside the diner on her first night. "I'm Thomas," he said, setting the thermos on the edge of the oak desk. "I was a city surveyor when Henry laid these bricks." He poured steaming black coffee into the metal cap and pushed it toward her. He did not ask why a 64-year-old woman was sleeping on cardboard. He did not ask about the dark circles under her eyes. He mentioned his wife had passed away 5 years ago in a hospital across town. He said the hospital foundation had been poured unevenly by Arthur's commercial firm. He said nobody had listened to the city surveyor about the concrete margins. Thomas drank his own coffee in silence, while Evelyn warmed her bleeding hands against the metal cup. He returned every single afternoon with a fresh thermos and half a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. The lowest point arrived on the 9th night. The temperature dropped entirely below freezing. A driving sleet hammered against the single-pane glass window. The wind found a gap in the masonry and whistled through the dark room. Evelyn pulled her dead phone from her purse. The black glass screen reflected nothing but the empty darkness. Arthur had not called the police to find her. The hundreds of corporate investors had not reached out. She was entirely erased from the world she had built. Her lower back spasmed so violently she dropped the phone onto the concrete floor. Her joints ached with a sharp, paralyzing cold. She thought, "I cannot fix a shattered window frame." She thought, "I am 64 years old with $20 left and I cannot survive winter in a room with no heat." The math beyond that was too large to look at directly. Evelyn lay on the damp canvas cloth in complete darkness. She listened to the sleet drum against the brick walls. She thought, "This is where I die. Not today, but this is where it ends. This is what dying alone looks like. She closed her eyes and waited for the cold to stop hurting, but her freezing hand brushed against the heavy brass key resting in her coat pocket. The metal was freezing, but the deep stamped numbers felt sharp against her skin. 1952. Her father had laid these exact bricks with his own calloused hands. He had survived brutal industrial winters in this exact room. He had not built this office for her to die in. She sat up on the damp cardboard mattress. She stared at the frost forming on the inside of the window glass. "I am not dying in this slaughterhouse," Evelyn said to the empty room. "I am not dying because Arthur decided I was worthless. I am 64 years old, and I still matter." She grabbed the splintered pine board and went back to sweeping the floor in the dark. The morning after the sleet storm, a new water leak developed behind the heavy oak desk. Evelyn traced the freezing water to a swollen pine panel at the base of the brick wall. She knelt on the concrete floor. Her swollen right knee pulsed with sharp, immediate pain. She used her splintered sweeping board as a lever against the rotting wood. She pushed her entire body weight against the makeshift pry bar. The rusted iron nails screamed as they pulled free from the masonry. The wooden panel cracked down the middle and fell forward onto the floor. A cloud of dry, 50-year-old dust plumed into the freezing air. Evelyn coughed. Her lungs seized in the sharp cold. She reached her bare hand into the dark cavity between the bricks. Her fingers brushed against cold, heavy steel. She gripped the handle of a dark grey metal lockbox. She pulled it out into the pale morning light. The box was covered in a thick layer of black grime. She wiped the surface with the hem of her damp wool coat. A heavy brass padlock secured the front latch. Evelyn stopped breathing. Her chest locked perfectly still. She stared at the thick brass padlock resting against the steel box. The keyhole was wide and jagged. She reached into her coat pocket with a trembling right hand. She pulled out the heavy brass key stamped with the year 1952. Her fingers shook so violently, she dropped the key onto the concrete floor. The metal clattered loudly in the empty room. She picked it up. She aligned the jagged teeth of the key with the dark opening of the padlock. She pushed the metal inward. It slid perfectly into the mechanism. She turned her wrist. The heavy iron tumblers clicked with a sharp, definitive snap. The padlock popped open. Evelyn removed the lock and set it on the oak desk. She lifted the heavy steel lid. The hinges protested with a loud metallic grind. Inside lay a thick stack of heavy parchment papers sealed in a waterproof canvas envelope. She untied the canvas string. She slid the papers out onto the center of the desk. Her hands left damp smears on the edge of the first page. She read the top document. She frowned in the dim light. It was an original municipal land survey dated 1952. It showed the triangular plot of the slaughterhouse. She thought it was simply her father's original building permit. She turned to the second page. She read the legal description of the property boundaries. She traced the heavy black ink with her cracked index finger. The boundary line did not stop at the rusted iron gates. The ink line extended outward. It encompassed the failing rail line. It wrapped around the dead river. It included the diner across the street. It circled the entire 2-mile eastern industrial district. Evelyn stopped. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. She leaned closer to the paper. She read the paragraph detailing the transfer of rights. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. Her lungs could not seem to pull enough oxygen from the freezing room. She turned to the third page. It was a master deed of commercial ownership. The document granted absolute municipal land control of the district to Henry Hayes. The document contained no expiration date. The final paragraph contained a specific, unalterable legal clause. The land rights could never be dissolved by corporate bankruptcy or municipal liquidation. They bypassed the surface structures entirely. They transferred immediately and irrevocably to the sole bloodline heir. They belonged entirely to Evelyn Hayes. Arthur's corporate lawyers had missed it. Arthur had purchased the surface buildings in a blind corporate bankruptcy auction years ago. He believed he possessed the entire district. He had leveraged his entire eastern commercial expansion plan on this specific acreage, but Arthur had only purchased the rotting wood and rusted metal sitting on top of the soil. He did not own a single inch of the earth beneath them. He had handed his exiled wife the exact legal mechanism to dismantle his empire. Evelyn read the entire master deed a second time. She checked the municipal seals at the bottom of the page. She checked the signature of the city surveyor. The name signed in fading blue ink was Thomas. Her hands stopped shaking. A profound, absolute stillness settled into her shoulders. She looked at the brass key resting on the desk. She looked at the faded ink, proving she owned the ground Arthur was trying to sell. She touched the paper exactly where her father had signed his name. "You knew," Evelyn whispered to the empty room. "You knew they would try to take it." She carefully folded the master deed back into the canvas envelope. The room was no longer cold. Evelyn walked out of the foreman's office holding the splintered pine board. She did not look at the rusted gates or the ruined roof. She looked directly at the massive iron brackets holding up the collapsed loading dock. She wedged the pine board under the first rusted bracket. She threw her entire body weight against the makeshift lever. Her shoulders burned and her swollen knees screamed in protest. The heavy iron bracket snapped free from the rotting wood and crashed onto the concrete. She dragged the heavy metal across the cracked pavement to the street. Thomas pulled his battered pickup truck up to the curb an hour later. He did not ask what she was doing. He simply dropped the tailgate and helped her lift the iron brackets into the truck bed. They drove 2 miles to the municipal scrapyard in absolute silence. The way station attendant handed Evelyn $84 in crumpled, grease-stained bills. It was the first money she had earned in her own name in 40 years. Evelyn walked into the hardware store next to the scrapyard. She purchased a thick blue plastic tarp and 3 tubes of industrial construction adhesive. She bought a used electric space heater from a pawn shop on the corner. She purchased harsh lye soap and a heavy steel wool brush. She carried the supplies back to the slaughterhouse. She climbed a wooden ladder Thomas had found abandoned in the alleyway. The freezing wind whipped her grey hair across her face. She stretched the thick blue tarp over the cracked roof tiles of the office. She sealed the edges with thick lines of black construction adhesive. The freezing drafts inside the room stopped immediately. The foreman's office transformed from a frozen concrete box into a dry space. She spent the next 3 weeks dismantling the interior of the ruined slaughterhouse. She salvaged 4 unbroken panes of thick, frosted glass from the old processing doors. She carried them carefully across the icy lot to her office. She scraped decades of grime from the glass using a rusted razor blade. She measured the empty window frame with a cracked yellow tape measure. She secured the clean glass into the frame using salvaged nails and fresh putty. The mechanic from the garage next door walked over on a Tuesday morning. He carried a heavy roll of insulated copper wiring over his shoulder. He traded the copper wiring for permission to park his overflow vehicles on her lot. Evelyn agreed and wrote a simple contract on a scrap of paper. Thomas wired the copper into the original electrical panel on the brick wall. He connected the system to the municipal grid using his old surveyor knowledge. Evelyn plugged in the small space heater. The metal coils glowed bright orange, pushing genuine heat into the freezing room. Evelyn knelt on the concrete floor beside the massive oak desk. She dipped the steel wool brush into a bucket of hot water and lye soap. The harsh chemicals burned the cracked skin on her knuckles. She scrubbed the heavy layers of black grease from the desk surface. She worked for 6 straight hours until her arms shook with exhaustion. The dark grime peeled away in thick strips. Beneath the dirt, the wood revealed itself as rich, golden oak. She polished the brass drawer handles until they caught the light. By the second month, the room was entirely unrecognizable. The damp cardboard mattress was gone. A sturdy iron cot salvaged from the rail yard sat in the back corner. A thick wool blanket, purchased with scrap money, covered a proper mattress. A small electric hot plate sat next to the humming space heater. The air inside the room smelled of fresh pine sawdust, hot coffee, and clean soap. The moment of genuine beauty happened on a Thursday afternoon. The bitter winter storm finally broke. The sun pierced through the heavy grey clouds over the city. The light poured directly through the clean, frosted window panes. It cast a warm, golden grid across the polished oak desk. The dust motes danced slowly in the bright, silent air. The rich wood glowed like amber against the dark red bricks. The office no longer looked like a forgotten ruin. It looked exactly like the headquarters of a woman who owned the ground beneath her feet. She stood in the center of the room. The inner transformation happened on a Tuesday morning. Evelyn emptied her worn leather purse onto the polished oak desk. The thick manila envelope from Arthur's corporate lawyers fell onto the wood. The final dissolution of marriage papers slid out from the metal clasp. For 2 months, she had carried her eviction like a physical weight. She looked at Arthur's sharp signature at the bottom of the page. She did not cry. She did not throw the thick stack of paper into the space heater. She simply felt the smooth texture of the expensive legal stationery. She reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a black ink pen. She flipped the heavy legal document completely over. She used the blank back of the page to sketch the new plumbing lines. She wrote a grocery list over the watermark of the city's most expensive law firm. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She walked to the back wall of the office. She placed her bare hand flat against the cold red bricks. Her father had laid these exact bricks 70 years ago. "You were right about the paper empires," Evelyn said to the empty room. "They blow away the second you open the door. The ground stays exactly where you left it." She closed her eyes and took a slow, deep breath. The sharp, burning pain in her lower back suddenly unspooled. The tight coil of tension in her chest released its grip entirely. Her lungs filled completely with the warm, pine-scented air. Her shoulders dropped 2 inches. She felt the physical weight of 40 years slide off her bones. The community did not arrive with a formal invitation. They arrived because the wind carried the smell of boiling coffee across the street. A woman named Sarah walked through the heavy wooden door on a Thursday. Sarah ran a small textile warehouse 3 blocks down the Dead River. Arthur's commercial firm had just tripled her monthly lease to force her out. Sarah sat on the salvaged iron cot and stared at her trembling hands. Evelyn did not offer hollow sympathy or warm platitudes. She poured black coffee into a tin cup. She slid the canvas envelope across the polished oak desk. She pulled out the master deed and pointed to the fading blue ink. She explained the municipal land rights, using her decades of corporate real estate knowledge. She showed Sarah exactly how Arthur's lease hike was legally void. By the 3rd week of March, the foreman's office was full. 6 folding chairs sat in a circle around the glowing space heater. The mechanic from the garage brought thick stacks of dry firewood. The diner owner carried over heavy ceramic plates of hot eggs and toast. A retired forklift operator brought a wooden crate of heavy roofing nails. They were all suffocating under Arthur's aggressive commercial expansion plan. They all believed they were entirely alone in their impending ruin. Evelyn sat behind the oak desk and reviewed their eviction notices one by one. She found the zoning loopholes Arthur's young corporate lawyers had completely ignored. She found the exact municipal codes that protected the historical industrial structures. She wrote formal letters of legal defiance on her heavy typewriter. She stamped them with the brass seal she had purchased at the pawn shop. She did not charge them a single cent for her intense labor. She traded her knowledge for their heavy lifting and salvaged building materials. It was a transaction between absolute equals. They did not view her as a discarded wife or a tragedy. They viewed her as the architect of their survival. The sound of the industrial district shifted. It was no longer the hollow howl of wind through rusted metal. It was the sound of hammers striking solid pine boards. It was the sound of heavy trucks backing into the cleared loading docks. It was the sound of a dozen people drinking coffee in a warm room. Evelyn sat at her father's desk and watched the snow melt outside the window. She touched the heavy brass key resting beside her warm cup. She belonged here. The sleek black luxury sedan crept over the cracked asphalt of the industrial lot on a cold Tuesday morning. Its heavy tires crushed the loose gravel near the rusted iron gates. The expensive vehicle looked entirely alien against the backdrop of shattered concrete and wild vines. Evelyn stood inside the warm foreman's office. She watched the car approach through the clean, frosted window panes. Arthur parked exactly 3 feet from the bottom concrete step. He placed the vehicle in park. He stepped out of the driver's side door into the freezing spring wind. He wore a tailored charcoal wool suit and a silver silk tie. He carefully stepped over a shallow puddle of muddy rainwater to protect his Italian leather shoes. He looked up at the towering brick walls of the slaughterhouse with obvious, unfiltered disgust. He walked up the 3 concrete steps. He raised his hand and knocked twice on the heavy wooden door. Evelyn did not hesitate. She wiped her hands on her canvas work apron. She turned the heavy brass handle. She pulled the thick door open. The cold spring wind blew into the warm, pine-scented room. Arthur stepped across the threshold. He looked at the polished oak desk and the glowing orange coils of the space heater. He looked at the dry blue canvas tarp stretched tightly across the ceiling. He looked at the mechanic from the garage drinking black coffee in the back corner. "We're worried about you, Evelyn," Arthur said. He kept his manicured hands deep in his expensive cashmere coat pockets. "Living in this environment at your age is simply not safe." He smiled, a tight, heavily practiced expression of deep concern. "I'm not being cruel. I'm being realistic." Evelyn did not offer him a wooden chair. She did not offer him a tin cup of hot coffee from the metal thermos. She stood directly behind her father's massive oak desk. "The mechanic's name is David," Evelyn said. Her voice was perfectly level and calm. "You tripled his commercial lease on the corner garage last Wednesday." Arthur ignored the introduction completely. He pulled a sleek black leather folder from inside his heavy winter coat. He placed it perfectly square in the exact center of the oak desk. He tapped the dark leather with 2 fingers. "I came to fix this mistake, Evelyn." He looked around the small brick room again. Dad would have wanted this property cleared. It's a toxic eyesore. He flipped open the heavy leather folder. Inside sat a crisp, white corporate purchase agreement. "I am offering to buy this entire liability back from you." He produced a heavy silver fountain pen from his breast pocket. "It will give you a comfortable nest egg for a proper apartment." He slid the silver pen across the polished wood. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Evelyn looked at the silver pen resting on the desk. She looked at the pristine white paper. Arthur had never cared about her safety or her physical comfort. His corporate lawyers had finally pulled the municipal land surveys for the Eastern District. They had finally discovered the massive, fatal error in his grand expansion plan. He could not legally break ground on his glass towers without the surface rights. He desperately needed her signature to save his empire from total financial collapse. Evelyn did not raise her voice. She did not throw the silver pen across the small room. She did not demand an apology for the freezing rain in November. She opened the heavy brass drawer of the oak desk. She pulled out the thick, waterproof canvas envelope. She untied the stiff cloth string. She slid the original 1952 master deed out onto the desk. She placed it directly over his crisp, white corporate purchase agreement. She pressed the fading blue ink flat with her calloused, work-worn hands. Arthur looked down at the heavy parchment paper. His eyes tracked the intricate legal description of the district boundaries. He read the municipal transfer clause. He read the unalterable surface rights assignment. He saw Henry Hayes' signature at the bottom. He saw the absolute absence of an expiration date. The color drained completely from Arthur's face. His jaw tightened into a rigid, hard line. His hands dropped to his sides. "You are not getting nothing, Evelyn," Arthur said. His voice dropped its warm, caring mask completely. "You are getting a massive cash settlement for a useless patch of dirt." Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. She saw the exact moment pure panic finally breached his polished exterior. He was a man standing on a corporate empire built entirely on borrowed ground. "You gave me this slaughterhouse because you thought it was worthless," Evelyn said. "Because you thought I was worthless." She pulled the heavy master deed back across the polished oak desk. She slid it carefully into the canvas envelope. "You were wrong about both." Arthur opened his mouth to speak. He had no rehearsed corporate speech for this exact architectural failure. He looked at the mechanic standing quietly in the shadows. He looked at his ex-wife standing behind a fortress of solid oak. He picked up his heavy silver pen. He picked up his entirely useless leather folder. He turned around and walked out into the cold spring wind. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. 6 months after the morning Arthur walked out the heavy wooden door. The Eastern Industrial District hummed with the steady rhythm of new construction. The rusted iron gates of the old slaughterhouse had been sold for municipal scrap. In their place stood a clean, wide avenue lined with restored brick warehouses. Sarah's textile trucks loaded heavy canvas bolts onto the newly poured concrete loading docks. David's mechanics worked on 3 different delivery truck engines in the warm corner garage. Thomas walked across the street carrying 2 dented steel thermoses of hot black coffee. Evelyn Hayes walked down the new concrete sidewalk, wearing her dark navy wool coat. She held a thick stack of finalized municipal building permits in her left hand. Arthur's commercial real estate firm had officially filed for bankruptcy the previous Tuesday. Without the eastern surface rights, his massive glass tower expansion had completely collapsed. His corporate investors had immediately withdrawn every single cent of their funding. The banks had seized his suburban estate and his corporate accounts to cover the massive debt. Evelyn did not attend the public liquidation hearings at the city courthouse. She stood outside the foreman's office and watched the morning sun hit the red bricks. She reached into her coat pocket with her bare right hand. She pulled out the heavy brass key attached to the worn leather cord. The metal stamped with 1952 caught the bright morning light. She traced the deep numbers with her thumb one final time. She did not need the key to unlock the heavy wooden door anymore. The door was propped permanently open with a solid pine block. Anyone in the district could walk inside to find a warm room and a fair lease. She looped the leather cord over her silver hair. The heavy brass key settled firmly against her chest. "It really was a clean break, Arthur," Evelyn said to the empty street. "True power is never found in the polished paperwork of those who exploit you. True power is found in the quiet strength of the foundation you stand upon." If Evelyn's story moved you, if you've ever been handed a ruin by someone who thought it would break you, leave one word in the comments, describing the moment she slid that master deed across the oak desk, because Evelyn's story proves something that is always true. The people who underestimate your worth will eventually hand you the exact tools required to dismantle their arrogance. Share this with someone who needs to remember that starting over at 64 is not a tragedy, but a masterstroke of absolute justice, because together we prove that dreams don't age.